the main questions now, one can see the blatant continuing attack of Russia on Ukrainian civil infrastructure. And at the same time, we hear different voices from United States about the possible negotiation with Russia. When, from your point of view, when will be the most suitable time to begin this negotiation? And what do you think about now? Is it time, or it would be better to wait and to continue offensive military activities?
I don't think the time is now, Vitaliy. I think the right time is when the Ukrainians decide, and I imagine that time will be when the Ukrainians have pushed the Russians out of their country. At that time, but probably not until then, will the Russians be ready to negotiate. When they're pushed out of the country, when the Ukrainian forces push the Russian forces out of the country, then the Russians will figure out that they can't win this war. And they will then come asking for serious negotiation. But right now is not the time. Right now, the Ukrainian military is pushing the Russians out. The Ukrainian military is winning on the battlefield. So why would there be a ceasefire to allow the Russians to stay in place when they're getting pushed out? So no, I don't think now's the time. I think the time might be, if the Ukrainians decide, the time might be when they have pushed the Russians out.
What do you think about the Crimea and Donbas? Before the open military invasion, Western politicians, they tried to divide these two tracks. Now, when we discuss the liberation of Ukrainian territory, it means both Donbas and Crimea.
In principle, yes, all Ukrainian territory should be free of Russians. All Ukrainian territories, Donbas, Crimea, should all be free of Russian forces. It doesn't have to all happen exactly at the same time. Right now, there are forces being pushed out of Donetsk, starting into Luhansk. There are attacks into Crimea. So the military dynamic will determine how fast and in what order the Russians are pushed out of all of Ukraine. Sooner or later, I think the Russians will all be out of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. From your point of view, should Ukraine liberate Crimea by the military force?
I think liberating Crimea by military force will be difficult. We see how the Ukrainian military is able to push on the Russians around Kharkiv, around Kyiv and around Kharkiv and around Kherson. The ground forces that the Ukrainian military has used in such skill and such effectiveness are the way to push the Russians out. The ground forces push Russians out. The artillery weakens the Russians, and the artillery damages their supply lines. But the ground forces are the ones that actually push the Russians out, and they reoccupy, deoccupy Ukrainian territory. So that's what would happen. To get ground forces into Crimea is more difficult than to get ground forces into Kharkiv or Kherson or Donetsk or Luhansk. Getting ground forces into Crimea means going across a narrow 5-mile, 8-kilometer isthmus. It's difficult to get there. So I think it would be difficult. But in the end, I think the Russians will have to leave Crimea.
We know that several days ago, European Parliament declared Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism, and the NATO's Parliamentary Assembly made the same decision. should we expect that, I don't know, maybe soon or late, but United States make the same decision?
I think so. I think we will decide that we can see what the truth is. The truth, of course, is that the Russians are terrorists, and they are using terrorism against the Ukrainians. So the whole world can see that they are terrorists. Labeling them as a state sponsor of terrorism is a legal action, and it's a political decision that I think the Biden administration will come to. They're not there yet. Congress has been very clear. Our Congress has been very clear that they think Russia is a terrorist nation. As you say, there are other parliamentary bodies around the world who are making these statements, other nations who are labeling Russia as a state sponsor of terrorism. So I think this will happen. I think, as you say, this will be sooner or later. The United States will label Russia a terrorist state.
Maybe you heard that former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev claimed that through this decision about recognition of Russia as a terrorist state, some global West, tried to get frozen money and to spend this money, Russian from this money, G7 and other countries, they want to spend this money on Ukraine or just get this money. There is some sense in this statement? Could it be the first step to really get this money and to spend this money on Ukraine?
Yes, I believe so. I believe that that the $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves that are stored in G7 banks, those are $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves that are in G7 banks. And that money is already frozen. And legal steps need to be taken in each of those countries to allow governments to take that money and put it into a fund for Ukrainian reconstruction, or put it into the fund that would allow Ukrainian government to draw on those funds to be able to pay the soldiers, or pay the healthcare workers, or pay the teachers, pay the government employees, pay the firefighters. The Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian government need this money. It's Russian money, and the Russians are responsible for this war. The Russians are going to have to pay reparations to Ukraine. And so it's good that the Russians have put their money in G7 banks. That allows those G7 banks and those G7 governments to freeze and then seize that money and put it into an international fund for Ukrainian reconstruction and Ukrainian government.
You are in Washington now after election. How you feel the atmosphere of Washington, and do you see some changes in policy toward Ukraine?
I don't see changes in policy toward Ukraine after the election. This is what I said before the election, and that's what I say now. That is, before the election, there was overwhelming bipartisan support for every Ukraine assistance package that came before the Congress. Overwhelming bipartisan. And the election won't change that very much. Maybe a one vote here or there. It won't change it very much. The next time there is a vote, which will come up soon, on the next big package, $37.7 billion more for Ukraine, will come up in the next month or so for a vote. And I predict that, again, there will be overwhelming bipartisan support for that assistance package for Ukraine.
On the background of this blatant attack on civil infrastructure, could Ukraine expect to get more sophisticated weapons, maybe aircraft, maybe more sophisticated missiles or something like that?
I think the answer is yes. I think there's the argument for longer range HIMARS, longer range weapons, heavier and more capable anti-aircraft weapons, more anti-aircraft air defense weapons. I think those arguments are stronger now. They're even stronger. They were strong before, but these attacks, these terrorist attacks, these criminal attacks on civilian infrastructure, on energy, on water, on heat, on hospitals, on schools, these horrify Americans. They disgust Americans. They enrage Americans, and that will lead to more support for Ukraine, more weapons, heavier duty weapons. We've already seen that begun to come from President Biden, and I think the Congress will support it as well.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about nuclear threat? During the last weeks, Russia was not so active as in previous time, but anyway, should we expect some unpredictable step from Russia in this area, in area of usage nuclear weapons?
I don't think so, Vitaliy. I don't think so. Of course, we cannot rule it out. Of course, when the Russians have those weapons, you have to worry that they might make a horrible decision, a blunder, a mistake, and actually use those. But I think the chances of that are very, very low. As you say, even they have backed off of these kinds of threats. I think even they have realized that these weapons are not useful on the battlefield. They are terrible for the Russian politics. I mean, they are terrible for international support. So there's no value and no reason for them to use these weapons. So I think the chances are very low, but they're not zero. You have to be ready for these. I think the chances are very low.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about the grain deal? Is it good for Ukraine, or sometimes we hear some critics against this agreement?
So I think the grain deal is a good thing, is good for Ukraine. It's good for the world food market. I think it's a good thing for products to be able to be sold on the international market. I know there is a question about the Russian ammonia, but I think it's very important for Ukrainian grain to be sold around the world, and for Odessa and Mykolaiv and other ports on the Black Sea to be open for this grain to be exported to the rest of the world.
Thank you for your time, that you always agree to comment and to communicate. If you have any questions or something else, free to ask again.
Thank you, Vitaliy. Thank you. Anytime. I'm glad to talk.